Hi, Cambria. We're going to take a look at your aesthetics and control, as well as the sun as key light postings. So let's jump right into it and share the screen here and take a look and see what we have. I think we're close to having this queued up here. Yeah, there we are. All right, so again, just as we typically do, taking a look at the overall to hold. Let's see, we've got the variety of those, how deep, basically just looking at to make sure that you've got everything kind of up there, the way that we're looking at it, the exposures, and you know better. Okay, so we have all four of those. Now, of course, this experiment was really all about both about getting to know the controls of your camera and how those controls affect the image itself. We're not just kind of dialing in numbers here. What we're doing is we're exploring what 1,000th of a second looks like, or what a 15th of a second looks like, because those are very abstract things when we just say 1,000th of a second. I mean, what does 1,000th of a second actually look like? So let me go ahead and jump into the actual visual, because I think I just clicked on the editing version, and this should bring us right into the much more open version here. Now, I'll just start off by saying, in this first image, this is quite beautiful. The way that you have incorporated shadow and atmospheric space in this image, all around within here, how you're creating this line, this curve of a line, that is a very important kind of component to a composition, where you're leading the eye. We don't really get into that a whole lot in this class. That's a previous class, actually, a compositional class. We talk about that in my expressive composition class, where we deal with line and we deal with shape and how that kind of affects the emotive quality. But this is a very good example of using those things in order to kind of lend a sort of quality to the photograph. And so you're using shape and you're using depth very well here. These look quite beautiful just in terms of that. Now, to hold, these shouldn't have been too much of a problem holding at 1,000th of a second. To hold at 1,000th of a second, it's not remarkable. I see here we're doing some drops here. Looks like we have a pine cone sort of dropping here. Those are the kinds of advantages that we have, where you're able to capture mid-motion. Now, there are other things that we could use to further kind of exaggerate that, things that aren't meant to be still, like a splash of water or dust or dirt and that kind of thing flying in the air or whatnot. Those kinds of things really can exaggerate the idea that you're shooting at a very high speed. The whole idea is that you're exploring what that 1,000th of a second can give you aesthetically. Then moving to 1/8 of a second, you can see immediately how that changes things. 1/8 of a second is much more difficult to hold on your own. Some people can do it, depending on the lens that you're using, depending on the camera, so on and so forth. There are techniques that you can do to hold it a little bit more steady. Holding a camera down to your chest is definitely much easier than to hold it up here. So if you're holding a camera right here, notice my arms and whatnot. Or in a triangle, it's a much more stable way to hold a camera, even though you can't really see. If you have an articulating viewfinder, you can kind of look down and photograph this way. It's a way to keep something more steady be able to shoot at longer shutter speeds and get this kind of beautiful exaggeration that's going on here. Composition's a little bit less structured here than what you were doing in the other. I can tell you're focusing more on the exaggerated movement than the formal composition. It gets a little bit more challenging when you start to get into some of these other movements, because you create compositions that you can't actually see, right? I mean, all of this beautiful stuff, and it is beautiful, is happening without you actually being able to see it until after the fact. And so you almost have to anticipate, make a lot of images, and begin to pre-visualize what you're going to be capturing, and then paying very close attention to the things that don't move. I think we might have been able to light this a little bit differently, so that they would take less of a factor. If they were less bright and more of the light was shown back toward here, you'd be getting more to what you're really looking at. I think you were really looking at all of this wonderful stuff that's happening back here. And it's a little bit distracting that this stuff is bright and sort of in focus, but not in focus, that kind of thing. So I think you're doing some good things, but obviously you get into some stuff where it becomes almost more confusing because you have so many more things to be thinking about. This one does a bit better because you've got the objects more in the foreground. You have fewer objects down here. The horizon's a little bit of a distraction. I think if we had cut it off right here, this corner wasn't here, you'd be in a much better shape. I want you to, when you're watching this video, go ahead and kind of like close your eyes and put your hand over this corner right here so you don't see this little dink dink like that. Put your hand over that and you'll see what happens. Suddenly it pacifies. That corner is very dynamic. An edge is dynamic, meaning it draws our attention to it. So if we cover that up, it becomes passive, it becomes just a horizontal line. And that's going to kind of make it emerge into the background, and it becomes less of a component and allows us to see all this cool stuff in the front. You see how this language is really cool, visual language. Once you're very fluent in it, once you become just facile, you just know it. You don't have to think about these little things. You just kind of intuitively know it, and it becomes it's just something that you can just kind of see automatically, kind of thing. So you'll get there. The more you practice, the more you do it, the better. Now, when we get into a half a second, now we're really moving. And this is gorgeous. This is just really beautiful shot, Cambria. You've got lighting that's happening very nicely. You've got the sort of a short lighting happening where the light is kind of coming from the side and toward the back. You've got this passive kind of landscape vision going on here. You've got a lot of horizontals in the composition, the physical composition, but then the movement's all sort of vertical, that contrast, really, really kind of cool. So all of that's working very, very well. This experimentation, like this one down here, that's really interesting, where you're getting this beautiful, beautiful movement. The compositions sort of stay samey, I guess. You didn't move this pile a whole lot, which it would have been cool if you'd done some more of that movement and selected others as you go. But again, as we add more elements to the experiments, you have more things to think about, and so you tend to forget about other things like moving the compositions around and stuff like that. That'll come. That'll happen as you continue to make photographs, as you continue to explore. You'll not have to think so actively about the stuff that we're working on. It'll become a much more sort of in the background for you, and you'll be able to make images thinking about all the stuff at the same time. This one's really kind of cool too, because you just go right into the abstraction altogether. Who says that photography has to be of an object? You know that I certainly don't think that. And this becomes just a movement of light, which is in fact what photography is all about, right? This as well. I'm glad you're taking the opportunity to do these kinds of things, right? This is, to me, is quite beautiful, and speaks more about the objects than of the objects. We talk about that a lot. We want images that are about rather than of. About means that you're communicating. Of means you're just sort of representing a thing. And so there's something that happens here with this movement that you get, and it's just absolutely beautiful. I think you tripped up on something here. Really, really quite nice. For some reason, we're getting question marks on some of this other stuff here. Not sure why. They're just not showing in the preview mode. Let's see if we can jump back into the other and see if we can see it in edit mode a little bit easier. Maybe they're there. There they are. Okay, how deep? Now, how deep? That's just the straight up aperture kind of thing. And this was a very straightforward exercise just to demonstrate depth of field. This should have been very straightforward just to show. And when I look at this one, it's not a whole lot of like conversation that needs to happen on this. Really what I'm looking at is to more or less see that you are able to work through the experiment itself, and that you've discovered where the apertures are and how to properly move through them. And it looks like you're doing just fine there. Hopefully, in doing this, that what you've done, that in the how deep, that you've discovered the value of depth of field. You've discovered the aesthetic value of depth of field, and how it can work for you, either deep depth of field, which is that those higher numbers, 22 and 16, or the wide or wide open apertures, which are like 5, 6, and even f4, which gives you a very shallow depth of field, a thin plane that's in focus, and then the focus falls off very quickly. Shallow depth of field can be very beautiful when you're doing still life, because you'll get that sort of depth that you're looking for. Here we have the exposures, where you are attempting to create these equivalent exposures. They all look a little bit dark on you. They're equally dark, so it looks like you did manage to capture the exposures in a consistent way, but they're consistently just a little dull and a little bit dark. We'll want to correct that definitely. Then we get to the better, and this is where you kind of explore a little bit. And I think you're at your best when we are sort of working with these the movement. You found something in some of those movement shots that I think are kind of aesthetically going to work for you really well. Let me see if I can't go back and jump into your image here, even though I don't know if I'm going to get a thumbnail or not. Oh, I guess I did. It kind of resolved. Okay, cool. When you were moving into these movement shots, that you've kind of found something that you can work with. Don't be afraid to make images that are completely abstract like this. This is not something that is there's anything wrong with making imagery like this. It's quite beautiful when you experiment with very shallow depth of field, when you experiment with lots of movement within your photographs and things like that. Compositionally, when you start to use shape and you allow things to run off the edge, I think you're at your best. When you're using shadows and highlights, I think you're at your best. So identifying where your strengths are, that's what you want to be doing when you're doing these kinds of more open-ended elements of the projects where it's sort of like, okay, explore and kind of, better, or here you kind of have the tail end of the experiment to kind of play around a little bit. Kind of try to identify some of the areas that that you're kind of clicking on, and then go for it on those, kind of like even push beyond those. And something like this is really quite interesting, I think, and you can maybe even do more with that. I think probably the most interesting of all of the images that you created were here in the to hold experiment, where you were working with the half of a second. It almost looked like you were really just having fun with them. So, when you find something that kind of works really well, just do it a lot, and even push beyond it, where then you begin to make images that don't work again. Then you've kind of exhausted and explored it completely. And then the ability to push through even that to get to the other side, that's when you really know that creativity is starting to happen. You got the experience, and you've moved through the experience and into something completely different and new. All right, so let's move into your other. Now move up into the sunlight here. Let's see, where is that going to be? There it is, sunlight as the key. All right, so this is where we were outside. This one was an exploration of previous things that we've been doing, just on a different scale, just on a different subject matter, using a different key light, which was the sun. And we worked in teams. This was an opportunity for you to communicate, working with those various scenarios. Here you were using the direct sunlight, where you're controlling it very well. We don't have harsh shadows, using a beautiful shallow depth of field here. So you're doing an excellent job with this. Moving in relatively close is a good idea. I think just in terms of composition, you're more effective here than something like this, where it becomes a little bit more kind of nondescript. You don't have a whole lot going on here as far as movement or shape. Here you've got some really beautiful line work that's happening. It can be difficult when you're working with shapes like these. This one has some really excellent direction that's happening, contrast between the green and the sort of beige color. This one, although you have the contrast of the beige and the green, it sort of is an all-over composition, and there's not a whole lot of direction that's happening to it. These are just subtle things to talk about. Here you're creating the horizon. Again, your lighting looks really good. In other words, you're controlling the light. It doesn't look like there's anything problematic. You don't have deep shadows that are falling off. Here again, you've got a really excellent sort of quality here. You got a lot of texture and energy that's happening. I think this is kind of a really interesting sort of take on this. It's sort of getting into the more of a textural kind of thing, and I'm kind of trying to look for a focal point, but I think as a lighting experiment, you're doing a very good job on this one. You see how this one kind of takes on more of a structural thing? I mean, I'm not talking about necessarily that everything has to be of shapes and everything has to be structured, but you can see the difference just in terms of like weight and gravity between this and this. This is quite beautiful, but what I'm looking for is somewhere for my eye to land. And this one definitely has somewhere for my eye to land. I want an entrance here, and here it does give me an entrance. And now we're into the windows. This is where you just had some time. I wanted you guys to go indoors next to a window light and use that window light as your key light. So this is where you're going to be using, like a light that's going to be moving, of course, the sun. You're going to choose the window based on what time of day you're working. It's probably going to be a diffused light because the glass is going to diffuse it a bit. And then you're going to need to reflect some light back into it. It looks like you did a pretty good job here. We get a little close to the edge here on compositionally. This could have tended to move over this way a little bit more. We're right over the top here, so there's a couple of things that could have cleaned the composition up. Right here, this is not really playing too much of a role in it. And over here, this gets a little close to the edge. These are really fine points in terms of composition, but I want to be able to point them out for you so that you'll be aware. This one's a much more controlled. You can tell that you're controlling it. I want to know what you want us to look at first. This little element, I think we either need more of it or less of it here. Again, these are just observational things where we're looking at how they're being used. I appreciate what you're doing here. You're trying to create a little shape here, it looks like. And I like how that's working. You got some excellent tension going on right here. This creates energy where otherwise would be maybe a real passive kind of look. You're creating this line here. This is really good right here to the line here on the globe. That works really well. There's lots of really good things that are happening here. There's just other things that you could use to kind of clean it up a little bit more. That's all. Again, experience and doing it more and doing it more. That's where you get into it. With photography, you really want to continue to reduce and reduce and reduce until there really is, nothing left to take out. Photography is a reductive sort of activity. I've said that many times. So when you're working with still life, I tend to suggest that you kind of pile things in there quite a bit. You kind of sort of collide things quite a bit in there, like put all the stuff in and then start moving things out. Set your camera up, put a bunch of stuff in there without really too much regard, and then begin pulling things out, removing things. It's either that or you find a ready-made, meaning you find a space that's already got things in it, and then you start to remove things or isolate things coming in closer, that kind of stuff. Adding things in front of a camera tends to lead to a very self-conscious looking composition, which isn't usually the best way to go about it. So we want to kind of avoid that when we can. It takes a really, I guess, experienced hand to be able to build a composition in front of the camera that looks unassuming and that looks natural. Believe it or not, that is a skill that takes practice, and not that you can't do that and you want to practice that. Just know on the other side, another way to do it would be to add a bunch of things and then start to reduce based on the camera. That's actually the more straightforward and natural way that photography works. So anyway, that's what I have for you. I appreciate your waiting on these two reviews. Having lost the first one, we redid it for you. So I look forward to seeing what your next experiment looks like, and we'll see you in class. All right, bye now.